Ever heard these before? The borrower is slave to the lender, and neither a borrower nor a lender be. The borrower is slave to the lender, neither a borrower nor a lender be. If you agree with these phrases, we think you're asking the wrong questions. These phrases are commonly repeated as if they are time-tested wealth wisdom, but could they mean something different than we think in their original context?
And then you have other people who say, you'll never build wealth if you don't use OPM, other people's money. We believe they're asking the wrong questions too. Here's the premise of today's episode. You're already a borrower or a lender, even if you have no debt or if you've paid off all of your debt. You're still in the game. How might you embrace it and make sure that you, quote unquote, win?
Hey, I'm Brandon, and welcome to the Wealth Wisdom Financial Podcast, episode 110. Debt-free isn't what you think it is.
And hey, I'm Amanda Neely. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, it's still me. We've been under the weather, getting our voices back. Everything's okay. We don't have COVID. Don't worry about us. We're almost back to normal. But let's talk about this debt thing. A big part of how people deal with money is to get out and stay out of debt. And that's really healthy. We don't want to discourage you from pursuing becoming debt-free because debt is a 4-letter word, quite literally. We're going to talk about that word literal a lot today. But could debt be moral, or is it always immoral? Should debt be avoided at all costs or used wisely? It's a much debated question. Ramsey says to get out of debt as quickly as possible. Kiyosaki talks about leveraging debt to grow your wealth. Wherever you land on debt, I think you need to hear today's story. It's a story that's not told. It's not well known. There's a few stories actually we're going to tell, but they illustrate that what you do with debt is actually more important than what you do with money. As G. Edward Griffin writes it, what we think is money is but a grand illusion. The reality is debt.
Now, are you sick and tired of hearing the same old financial advice? We feel you. We're fed up with the same old truisms that fall flat when you get into the unique opportunities and challenges of these specific situations you're facing and we're facing today. This show is all about bringing you historic wisdom around building wealth with practical insights on how to apply it to your journey. When conventional financial thinking doesn't get you to where you want to go, you need wealth wisdom. Let's master wealth building together.
First, we have to acknowledge that debt is often moralized. Those phrases that we used at the beginning are just the tip of the iceberg. We don't want to pretend like any religion is homogenous here. For example, we know some Muslims who won't even use an interest-bearing savings account due to a religious conviction called riba, and other Muslims who participate in the money system in ways identical to atheists and agnostic friends that we have. We wouldn't, judge either or say one is more holy than the other. They're just exercising their moral faith in different ways.
Similar with some Christian friends, some will not use debt or even a credit card, and others that use them freely, maybe too freely sometimes, in my opinion.
No judging. No judging.
Yeah, no judging. I'd venture to guess that the majority of Americans, even for those who wouldn't consider themselves religious or spiritual, there's still this nagging sense that being in debt is bad. And not just mathematically bad, but morally bad. There might be this gray area between good debt and bad debt, but it's a slippery slope. And we don't necessarily feel like we're being bad when taking on some debt, but there's plenty of guilt and shame when we've taken on too much or things don't go according to the plan and we're strapped with payments.
What we believe as wealth wisdom is not trying to find the line between good and bad debt, nor is it avoiding debt entirely, if that's even possible, which it could be. We believe in order to find the wealth wisdom here, you have to change the entire frame of the consideration and ask totally different questions.
And before we get to the story, here are those commonly repeated phrases in their original context. Because remember, we said it at the beginning. I want to say where they came from and their context, because that's really important. So the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. The rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is slave to the lender. Comes from Proverbs 22:7.
We ask you, might this be a warning to the rich to remember that they rule over and the potential corruption when one becomes the master of a poor borrower turned slave? How many of us are okay with being lenders when we call being in debt immoral? For those who do read the Bible, you can go back and read Leviticus 25:35-37 for more in the context of lending from this biblical perspective. And then come back and read the entire chapter of Proverbs 22. Pay close attention to verses 22 and 23. What you'll notice is that a lot of who they're talking to are the rich and the lender, not the poor or the slave. Our point here is to remember that there are two sides of debt, the borrower and the lender. If you won't be one, will you be the other?
Or could you be both? Oftentimes. Which brings us to the next phrase. Neither a borrower nor a lender be is a line from Act 1, Scene 3 of Shakespeare's play Hamlet, not the Bible, which people often quote it and say it's from the Bible, and it's not.
And despite my voice, I'm going to try to do some of the context here. It comes from this big, long monologue. And here's where we pick it up. Neither a borrower nor a lender be, for loan oft loses both itself and friend, and borrowing dulls the edge of husbandry. This above all, to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day. Thou canst not then be false to any man. Farewell, my blessing season this in thee. This is all said by this guy named Polonius in the Hamlet play. He is not a good guy. This whole monologue is supposed to come across as advice that is pompous, hypocritical, and empty. He's giving it to his son, but it's coming from not a good father, not a good guy, who's like very pompous and saying, to thine own self be true, when he's not true to himself either.
I think you should talk like that more often.
I think so too, especially with this voice. It kind of feels more authentic.
Yeah. So let's move to the deeper questions beyond if debt is moral or immoral. The first question is this: what if everyone paid off their debt? What would happen if everyone paid off their debt?
Well, Brandon, could everyone pay off their debt? Consider this. According to uscurrency.gov, there was over $2 trillion in circulation at the end of 2020. That's how much actual currency there is in the US, $2 trillion.
That's a lot of money.
At the same marker, there was over 14 trillion in household debt. That's 7 times more than the money supply. And it doesn't count business debts, government debts, and other non-household debts. Yikes. If every household in America decided to become debt-free, there wouldn't be enough money to pay off the debt. Holy cannoli, Batman.
Do you see why we have to reframe the question from is debt good or bad? So the second question to ask is, who creates the money to lend and who creates the money to pay the interest? This seems easy on an individual level. The money to lend comes from the bank. Your own efforts to earn money create the money to pay it back with interest. But where does the bank get the money, and where did those who pay you, your customers or your employers, get the money?
So here's where we get to one of my favorite stories. We're going to get into our time travel machine. We're going to travel back to September 30th, 1941. The world is at war, but in America, baseball just wrapped up its season. The manufacturing of weapons for our allies is bringing us out of the Great Depression. things are looking positive. In the House of Representatives, the Committee on Banking and Currency is hearing testimony to learn about what caused the Great Depression. We seem to be coming out of it, but we still need to understand what caused it so we can make sure it never happens again, right? And being interviewed on this particular day is Mariner Eccles, governor of the Federal Reserve System. He is a Republican from Utah. And we enter the room to hear Congressman Wright Patman, a Democrat from Texas, drilling Eccles, asking how the Fed, the Federal Reserve, got the money to purchase $2 billion of government bonds in 1933, which I don't even want to know how much $2 billion is worth today for that value in 1933. So we walk in, Patman is just asked, where did the Fed get the money? And Eccles says this: we created it. Patman, out of what? Eccles, out of the right to issue credit money. Patman, and there is nothing behind it, is there, except our government's credit? Eccles, that is what our money system is. If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. Let's rewind 30 seconds. Repeat that. This is what our money system is. If there were no debts in our money system, there wouldn't be any money.
Now, this isn't a show about the Federal Reserve, but I should mention that to understand what's happening here, you have to understand that the Fed is not part of our government and it's not a bank.
And as much as the Fed's been in the news with raising interest rates, and they have a lot of control despite their precarious situation, which, you know, the borrower is slave to the lender. If we're all borrowing from the Federal Reserve, who becomes the master in this situation? Because also, if you pull a dollar out of your wallet, could be a $1 bill, $20 bill, if you even use cash, go and pull it out, look at the top of it. And in the middle at the top, you're going to see 3 words: Federal Reserve Note. What do they mean by note? Surely the Federal Reserve hasn't passed you a note like you do in middle school. There's no, circle or X, will you be my girlfriend kind of thing. That's short for banknote or promissory note. It's a promise to pay a stated sum to the bearer on demand. The bill you hold is a promissory note, quite literally a debt.
And that's exactly what Eccles is admitting to in this story. Money is created by debt. If you want to go research how the U.S. Treasury, a government entity, and the Federal Reserve, a private institution, interact, I highly recommend you do that. We don't have time to go into that today, but it's the foundation for the entire financial system in the U.S. So it's kind of important.
Yeah. And for the nerds out there, what you'll learn is that we've actually had 3 national banks. The Federal Reserve is the 3rd one. The first 2 failed.
Don't just watch Hamilton and think you figured it out. Actually do some research.
Yeah. Now, we also have to throw this tidbit in there. We're no constitutional scholars, but as we understand it, the U.S. Constitution only gives our federal government the right to coin money. That's literally the word in the Constitution, coin, meaning they can't print money. They can't create a digital currency. So what Congress has done is authorize the Federal Reserve to do something the United States government isn't allowed to do itself. And actually, if you pull a coin out of your pocket, a quarter, a penny, you won't see the words Federal Reserve. You won't see the reference to a note. Those are created by the U.S. Mint. Our government is actually allowed to make those coins.
So let's take a step back from the Federal Reserve and how they created money out of thin air. Let's make this practical for you, the listener. What is the journey your money takes when you deposit it into the bank account, and how does that impact everybody else?
So let's say you decided right now to put $100 into a bank account. You might not have an actual $100 bill to deposit. Everything is mostly done virtually these days, but let's imagine you put a $100 bill in the bank. What happens to that $100 bill depends on the bank's assets, but let's say, and in most cases, they only need to keep about 10% of that $100 on deposit. The other 90%, the other $90, they can lend out. And that's what they usually do.
So the bank can take my $100 and lend $90 of it to someone else, only leaving $10 in the vault, right? Now, that's not that big of a deal until you think about how banks are connected, right? The person who received the $90 might spend it at the business, who then deposits it into a different bank. Then that $90 can be leveraged by the bank, and then they can lend $81 out to another person who gives it to someone else, and they deposit it in bank three. Bank three can take that $81 and lend another $72.90 to someone else, and so on and so forth. So it just gets crazy.
Yeah, I did the math and found that $100 that you've deposited into the bank could actually become almost $1,000 if enough banks and exchanges were involved. Can you imagine what happened to the $250 billion that was part of the bank bailout in 2008 to create this cash infusion into the banking system to facilitate and encourage bank-to-bank loans and other types of lending? $250 billion. Or the economic stimulus money that every taxpayer received during the pandemic, and many just put those into their bank accounts. And that same act also seems to have loosened the 10% reserve restriction, but you'll need to ask a well-versed attorney to translate that part for you. Even worse than the Constitution.
It's crazy, right? And that's is why it's so important for us to kind of have a little bit of understanding about it. Now that you see what happens to money deposited in a bank and the journey it goes on, now you can start to ask some powerful questions. So here's some of those questions. You might want to write these down. Is the money in my bank account facilitating risky lending? If there wasn't so much available and getting into debt were harder, might some people not take as much risk?
Might we have fewer bankruptcies, for example? Yeah. Here's the next question. Is the money in my bank account creating higher prices? I mean, what would prices be like if we didn't have the system and there was only $2 trillion available for being in debt or spending, and rather than 14 trillion being added, to the household debt?
Another question to ask is, who's profiting off the money that I deposited in the banks? Or who's profiting off of the system that we contribute to? Now, I'm not against people being profitable, but I am concerned about how that profit is distributed within a company to the wealthy stockholders and executives, while the janitor and the teller struggle to see their wages increase. I think that's a problem that we are seeing all over the place.
Here's another question. This one's big. You might want to write this one down. Could the entire debt system be why we have such big boom and bust cycles?
Yeah, I think that's a powerful one. And how safe is the money in the bank really? If that $100 has become almost $1,000, there's no way everyone can get their money back at the same time. If there was like a run on the bank, like there was back in the 1920s.
Or in Mary Poppins, that's what I always think about. And actually, some people say, well, Brandon, we have the FDIC. It's basically insurance for the banks in case everyone does want their money at the same time. But when you look at the FDIC's public reports, actually right there on their homepage, I just looked at it this past week, you can read, as of March 31st, 2022, they had $123 billion in their deposit insurance fund. That's how much they have available to bail out the banks.
Which sounds like a lot, but when everybody's kind of together and you think about it from a bigger, grander scheme of things, 123 billion isn't that much.
Right. Especially when you look at their quarterly reports, and the last quarterly report says that they only have 1.23% of their funds that they're insuring. So that 123 billion represents 1.23% of the money that people think that is insured in bank accounts. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't seem very safe to me. Maybe they should call them risk accounts rather than savings and checking accounts.
So is there any other options We've run out of time for today, but join us next time for an overview on how you might become better than debt-free. That's going to be our next episode because we opened up a whole can of worms here, but we wanted to have an episode specifically on how we're building our system and how you can become better than debt-free.
So to wrap up today, I have to share what I found in a booklet from the Federal Reserve called The Two Faces of Debt. I'll put the link in the show notes. Here are two sentences that I think summarize pretty well what we've talked about today. Everyone at some time or another has seen the disastrous consequences of excessive accumulation of debt by a person or business. Conversely, growth and prosperity have flourished at times when overall indebtedness was rising rapidly, and some economic slowdowns have coincided with periods of debt reduction. Thus, debt appears to be both good and bad, a paradox that has challenged philosophers for centuries.
As the same booklet puts it, debt is here to stay. But what about you? Do you need to stay in debt or, in that place?
The likely response, if you were to ask the Federal Reserve what you should do, would be something like, well, if you want the economy to keep growing, if you want the stock market to continue to grow, go up and to the right or recover when it goes down, then yeah, you need to stay in debt.
And what's your reaction to that statement? If you're like me, it's one of disgust. My reaction is, I don't want my money to go to interest just to keep the economy growing and the stock market soaring, and likely make other people more money than I can keep myself, right? And I don't like that. After all, who owns the majority of the stock market and where did they get the money to purchase their shares is another big question that we're not going to go into, but it's a question to ask.
But what about this? Would you pay 20% interest on a credit card to keep your retirement funds growing at, say, 10%? Probably not. But would you pay about 4% on a mortgage for the rest of your life to possibly make 10% in that same retirement account? People would probably say, yeah.
And only you can answer those questions for yourself. But I think there are some of the most important questions that you can ask.
And here's my last question for today. When I think of the words financial freedom, for me, that doesn't mean debt-free per se. It actually means more like being free from the entire monetary system where I don't use money. Anytime you touch money, you're using debt, either as a lender or a borrower. Financial freedom is more literally, there's that word again, literally, freedom from finance. In this definition, the hippie living in an eco village, growing all their own food, living off the grid, not having to ever touch money, they have more financial freedom than Elon Musk. So here's my final question for you today. How might your financial freedom journey change if your idol, the person you were looking up to, was the eco village living hippie instead of a business tycoon?
Yeah, that's definitely a different person, right?
A totally different trajectory of how I might go toward financial freedom.
Yep. And attainable.
Maybe.
And as you're learning new information or coming up with fresh ideas, it's difficult to decide what to carry through with and when. So we've developed a filter to use when deciding how to move forward towards your goals and dreams, financial and otherwise. It's a free gift to you waiting at stillmethod.com. So go download stillmethod.com. It's a great resource and a framework we use every month to go through our goals, plans, where we're heading, where we want to go in the future. So go download it today at stillmethod.com.
And if you can't tell yet, wealth wisdom goes so much deeper than pithy little phrases taken out of context. Hit that subscribe button and join the next episode where we'll dive into how we might move to a way of financial life that's better than debt-free.
So until next time, keep building your wealth simply and sustainably so you can break through to a smart, stable financial future. And we hope you live long and profit, not just for the banks, but for yourself. We don't want these big bank tycoons to be making all the quote unquote big returns. We want you guys to be making a bigger impact.
If you do work for a bank, we love you. You're awesome. Keep up your good work. We can't live without banks either.
Yeah, right. That's the challenge. That's the problem sometimes. So the topics presented in this podcast are for general information only and not for the purpose of providing legal, accounting, or investment advice. On such matters, please consult a professional who knows your specific situation.